What's up guys, welcome back to the Home Slice for another video that's sort of out of the rotation. I saw recently that Erica's EDC had posted up another video where she talks about the sort of mechanics of dulling, how different knives dull, and she put them on a scale, sort of spectrum from her own experience, and sort of scaled them from ones that microchip but hold aggression down to ones that virtually never chip but get a little bit glassy or slippery at the edge and lose a bit of that edge aggression. If you somehow managed to make it to this video without checking out that video first, I would highly recommend it. I'll try to throw a link up there on screen now. Pause this and go check out what Erica has done. It's really, in my opinion, sort of another step in this conversation that knife users need to be having in the community on YouTube here, should be having, in terms of gathering information from your experience, gathering information from each other, and sharing in different ways to sort of hone in our sharpening and carry methodologies. I saw the video and wanted to respond right away like, oh my gosh, this is so good. But unfortunately last week I got sick and I was taken out for like 3.5 days. It was intense. It was really brutal. So I'm on the up and up now and coming back at it. But here we are, we're inhabiting next week. That's how this rolled out. I really enjoyed Erica's video, and I sort of agreed from my own personal use with how that sort of edge breakdown happens on different steels. And she put, Rex 121 up at the top and ADC RV2 down at the bottom, and created this sort of spectrum from microchipping to sort of rounding over or glassing out, and is an excellent video. The one thing that I would say, not to sort of correct, but to sort of nuance the conversation, is Erica mentioned that the ones at the top of the scale, like your Rex 121, your Maximet and stuff like that, are losing bits of material, and the ones at the bottom are not so much. And I think I know what she means. I think I would nuance it a little bit to say that the ones at the bottom of the scale are losing steel atom by atom. Those little fibers of your cardboard or not are actually wearing away like micro sandpaper, that edge. And that's why it ends up rounding over time, where the ones at the top are losing bits of crystal, bits of the steel crystal or the carbide are coming out. And that could sound sort of deceptive because it sounds like, oh, you're actually experiencing a lot more damage to those ones that are really hard, that are at the top of Erica's scale, and a lot less in those ones at the bottom. But actually, depending on what steel you're working with, the abrasion and wear can happen quickly enough that you can actually have a very similar loss of steel. Likewise, the bits that you lose from your Rex 121, your Maximet, your 15V, those really high carbon steels are tiny little microscopic pieces of steel. And oftentimes the bunch of little tiny carbides in the steel, they form these little pins where the grain of the steel goes along them. And so they make sure that you only lose a teeny little bit at a time, just the amount of crystal between a set of carbides usually, which is just a few microns depending on your steel. Last time Erica came out with a video, I came out with a sort of response video, and I thought I might do sort of the same thing, but rather than kind of focusing on or redefining in some way what she's talking about, I feel like she covered it super duper well. And what I want to talk to you about is the other end of sharpening. So Eric is talking about mind your dulling. If you mind the way that you dull, you'll become a better sharpener. And today I'm going to talk about the same scale that Erica referenced, but talk about how we experience each of those steels in terms of burr formation. And I'm going to explain some concepts in simple terms that are often misunderstood. Namely, I'm going to talk about positive and negative burr steels. All right, so Erica sort of arranged all of the different steel that she was talking about into a spectrum, and it sort of ranged from Rex 121, which she used the word chippy to describe, and I think that's an effective way to describe what she's experiencing. And it went all the way over to things like ADC RV2, or perhaps your AEBL, And she described these as steels that tend to sort of glass out. And she's making this sort of spectrum. She mentioned as she goes through chippy, 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 and then she hit CPM Magna Cut. And she said that that's sort of the first one for her experience in the glassing outside of things, but it's somewhere here near the middle. So I don't know where you want to stake out the middle between chippy and steels that sort of round over, but you've got kind of a spectrum covered. And I wanted to clarify from my last video, because I mentioned that with sharpening, you can make softer steels sort of perform a little bit more like powder steels and what the physics are behind that. But I want to mention that there's many levels in between these. And if you coarse sharpen your 80 CRV2, will it act more like Rex 121? Yes. Will it act like Rex 121? No. So what I mean to say is that with sharpening, you can create these incremental leaps. With sharpening your 80 CRV2, maybe you figure out a real screaming dual grit protocol. You've got a coarse stone on one side and a fine on the other, and you've got lots of aggression. You will move this 1 or 2 steps toward the center, and it will act a little bit more like a steel that dulls in a chipping and aggression retaining, working edge retaining sort of manner. Likewise, if you take your Magna Cut, say, and you want to chop some wood with it, if you find a super effective, super clean fine edge, and you just get that thing clean, 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 you will move it a little bit further this way to be less likely to be damaged by large-scale chipping and stuff like that. But also, you are going to compound the fact that it tends to round over or glass out a little bit more easily than some of the knives on this side of the spectrum. So Erica is sort of creating this conversation regarding what's happening at the end of your edge life, carrying an awareness of how that should affect your sharpening experience. And I think that that is so good and so needed. And also at the same time, there is a way to talk about how these different steels act that's related to edge formation and sharpening. And the word that's often used is negative burr. I'm going to put a little minus here over Rex 121, and positive burr steels. So what do people mean when they address the differences between this same spectrum and they're talking about a negative burr steel versus a positive burr steel? Well, what we're really talking about is the inherent ductility or bendability of the steel and how that translates to how a steel tends to form a burr at the edge. So let's take Rex 121, for example. Rex 121 tends to be a very negative burr steel. If we think about this is an edge that we're sharpening, then to call it negative burr is this admonition that you have when you're sharpening these pieces of abrasive. These pieces of abrasive are moving across the edge, removing material. Now, Rex 121, let's say within it, at whatever hardness level it is, it will have an ability to bend. Metal has the ability to bend. And so if you think of this is sort of your center angle, then when that piece of abrasive gets there, maybe Rex 121 has the ability to bend 3 degrees, we'll say, without shearing off. These are just made up numbers I'm trying to help you visualize, okay? However, when a piece of abrasive actually goes across that final little bit of edge, maybe it wants to bend the metal on average, let's say 8 degrees, okay? This angle is 8 degrees. That's actually not, I know that's not very accurate. Because Rex 121 has a bending limit of, we're saying here, 3 degrees, and as the sharpening abrasives move across the edge apex, they're trying to move the apex 8 degrees. This burr will largely shear off and be removed. So you will experience it as the steel forming less burr. Is it impossible for it to bend and retain damaged metal? No. It's not. It's just that the level to which it does that is less than the level which sharpening normally subjects the steel to moving metal. Vice versa, you've got ADCRV2 if you've got, your abrasive particle and it's moving across the apex, and it's a very, very high flexibility, ductility steel. Let's say that your sample of ADCRV2 in terms of our angle, missed the middle. In terms of our angle, it can bend up to 15 degrees. I know it's way more than 15 degrees. And if in the same case, your piece of abrasive moving across the edge at your edge angle wants to bend it 8 degrees, then the steel is going to allow itself to be bent over the apex at that angle without shearing off the damaged metal. And in your user experience, what you find is a much larger and more difficult to remove burr in your more positive burr steels. Now, I've not done justice fully to the theory, and the guy who sort of popularized this, at least in my researching, is a guy named Vadim Krychuk, and he ran the YouTube channel and website Knife Grinders Australia, and he did lots and lots of empirical testing to sort of quantify the different burr forming characteristics of different steels. So there's a little bit more to positive and negative burr formation. It's also about, as the piece of abrasive digs in, it creates a little channel of subsurface damage. And as you get to the tip, that channel of subsurface damage sort of reaches across the apex. And it is a little bit about whether the chipping follows that line or the steel throws the burr completely over and that damaged line of metal is inside of it still. So there's a bunch going on there, but that's kind of all I'll say on that. All you need to know is that a steel has an inherent level of flexibility. And some steels, if you just sharpen them at the sharpening angle, they'll shear off much larger pieces of burr, and you'll have less serious burr to worry about or easier burr to remove. And that characteristic is called negative burr formation. And other steels are flexible enough and they can endure a big enough level of bending that when the abrasives go across, the whole wave of metal getting pushed in front of it goes over the edge and clings there in the form of a larger burr. And that characteristic is called positive burr formation. So now you know everything you need to know. Just go find which steels are negative burr and your sharpening experience will be easier. Not quite. Okay, not quite, because in conversation with Dr. Todd Simpson, I sort of talked to him about this construct that Vadim Krychuk created, and I said, well, where is the line actually between positive burr and negative burr, and which steels do which? And he said to me, essentially, like, well, Gabe, every steel, as you're sharpening, it will be forming positive burrs and negative burrs along the edge at different points at the same time. The simplification is helpful because it can help you change your sharpening method and your angle control to best suit your steel. However, every little piece of steel with an abrasive going across it will have a slightly different experience and formation than others. So I'm so sorry for those of you who didn't like high school math. If you want to skip to this point, this is the point past this rabbit hole. But basically what I have come to understand more or less is that this is like a bit of a continuum. You know, you've got Rex 121 and your super hard, crazy hard steels, and you've got your more homogeneous, lower carbon steels. But steels don't have a point on this. This isn't like ADCRV2's point. Steels have a bell curve, okay? And so maybe ADCRV2's bell curve is like this. And this is the likelihood of what kind of burr it will form. And maybe, you know, whatever portion this is, that you've got like a 3% chance that 3% of the edge is going to be forming those helpful negative burrs. And then you've got a 97% chance. Well, maybe somebody hardened their ADCR V2 really, really, really hard. Maybe it's 64 Rockwell. Or maybe they sort of moved their bell curve like way over here, and suddenly it's got a lot more chance of making a negative burr and a reduced number of instances where you're going to have large burr. So it moves around. Some of them would be wider, you know, if the heat treatment is not super consistent, or you've got a steel that the composition of it has a really wide possibility of characteristics like MagnaCut. You may have like a wider bell curve. You know, you may be equally likely to form big burr or have the burr shear off at any given point of edge. So you can't exactly just simplify it down to like, this is a negative burr steel, therefore it's good, therefore it's the best, therefore it's never going to form a burr, and I'm going to have this perfect sharpening experience. So you actually need to tool up to know how to deal with different kinds of burrs when they get formed. So how do you deal with different forms of positive and negative burr? Well, if you're working with steels that are on the positive burr side of things, if this is your edge going into the stone, it's worth noting that if you have a big positive burr, your edge leading strokes are going to bring the abrasive this way, and that burr is going to have to try to fold under the tip, and that folding under and getting hit with abrasive has this shearing effect to take them off. It's also worth noting that you can utilize your sort of methods like high angle passes. I'm not going to redraw the knife, but if you just imagine that I've lifted it and now your stone is at a little bit more of an angle. Now you're actually changing the angle that the burr has to bend to and not shear off. And so you're increasing that angle, trying to hit that threshold I talked about of where it won't flex anymore and suddenly the burr shears off. You can also use more compressive strops that compress a little bit more. When you're rubbing the edge along, you know, you've got your strop material, and then if this is your edge, it flexes down a little under it. And then on the flex back up, it will increase the angle. Again, look at that. It will increase the angle that the burr would have to bend to stay put. And you're trying to exceed that angle that it can physically bend to and still cling on and shear it off. Another thing that you can do is in your stropping, you can utilize larger particles. So your 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, whatever, micron particles in a compressive strop. All of these things are going to give you better and better chance to strip off a steel, even though it has positive burr forming tendencies. They are going to mean that you're going to wrap your tip to a little bit more of a convex for more of those little microns right out near the edge. But that's something you kind of have to deal with, in my opinion, if you're going to be sharpening positive burr steels. They have their place. I love ADCR V2 and my Scrama. I chop with it all the time. But you've got to actually embrace it and be like, okay, I'm going to use a compressive strop on this. I'm going to use a little bit larger particles in my strop because I know the burr forming tendencies of this are such that I'm going to have to get more angle around the tip to get that burr to strip off all the way and have a totally clean cutting edge apex. Well, what does that mean for your negative burr steels? Like, you know, you might be like, does that mean that they're just completely worry-free? Not exactly. Like, what it actually means is that you are going to want to utilize smaller particles because you don't want to overround. That overrounding that is beneficial for your positive burr steels can actually be detrimental to the crystal structures, the carbide structures, and the characteristics of your negative burr steels. So you want a hard strop, you want a flatter strop, you want smaller particles in your strop. In some cases, the steel is hard enough that you want to stick to just edge trailing, because edge trailing passes will strip the burr off easily by themselves. And if you go edge leading, then you sort of do this dance with, if you get the wrong angle, you can dig in, and that can be really damaging for a negative burr steel. So you kind of got to read the situation and your experience of the different steels to dial in your deburring, because just like Erica's talking about, your dulling is like one side of this spectrum that paying attention to it helps you. Your deburring is the front end of that. Your deburring and your dulling, they actually share these characteristics. And as you observe both, you'll become better and better and better at choosing the steels you like and sharpening the steels that you choose. So generally, pretty much people want to know, well, what's the right way? Like, what's the best steel? And I'm gonna go through 3 quick case studies. Now, please, please, please listen to my disclaimer. I do not think that I'm smarter or better at sharpening than any of these people. These are just the first few examples that came to my mind to illustrate for you the dynamics of positive and negative burr. And I mention these to build an inclusive view for you, so you can see that, like, people in the other camps of knife sharpening and stuff, they're not crazy. They have actually found stuff that works for them, and that's totally valid. But you need to understand the reasons why they're doing that in order to see the validity of their perspective. So the first person that comes to mind for me is Cliff Stamp. A lot of you guys will remember talking with Cliff and his videos, and Cliff Stamp was an amazing, early adopter in the sort of steel and knife world. And he sort of settled in this place where he was like, you know what is the best steel in the world for knives? The best steel in the world for knives is 14C 28N. And a whole bunch of people wrote him off. They're like, that dude doesn't know what he's talking about. That's a low alloy steel, yada, yada, yada. Now, 14C 28N has won out its fanboys over time, but what most people don't realize is there's a couple of things, okay? So he's talking 14C 28N, but he's like, hey, if you heat treat it this way, you can reach 63 or 64 Rockwell with it, and then it has phenomenal properties. And so one thing that people wouldn't have understood is they would have thought Cliff Stamp's preference is way out here, but he's actually advocating for more stringent hardening that would put the bell curve of the burr that 14C 28N forms much, much closer to the negative burr side of things. It's such a homogeneous steel, though, that it would still have positive burr formation tendencies. So how did he deal with that? Well, I am by no means the biggest Cliff Stamp aficionado, and some of them will watch this video, so you guys can correct me in the comments, but it's my understanding that he was a proponent of what he called burrless sharpening. Now, there is no sharpening without damaged metal. So if somebody comes up to you and tells you well, I just sharpened, there's no burr, there's no damage, they don't fully understand the physics of what's going on there. The Cliff didn't believe that, but he believed that burr minimization while you sharpen is the easiest, most efficient way to sharpen. And I think in a lot of ways, he was right. So he would have these positive burr steels, and he would lay them to the stone, and he would do sort of a set of edge leading or scrubbing strokes across the stone. And he would know about how many of those strokes it would take from his past experience to form a burr, and he would go just shy of that, and then he would switch to the other direction and back and forth to the other direction. And in so doing, he would never allow an extremely large positive burr to build up. And then at the end of his sharpening sessions, I should say at the beginning, he would always de-stress the edge. So these positive burr steels tend to carry a lot of damage over time, and he would actually take it straight to the stone and cut off the tip of fatigued steel each time he sharpened, just cut that off. And then he would do this to keep bringing it closer and closer to that new apex without piling up a lot of damaged metal. And then he'd have a fairly minimally damaged edge. And then at the end of most of the sharpenings that I've ever seen Cliff Stamp do, he would lift that knife up just a little bit off of the angle that he has been working at and do a couple of passes that are just a couple of degrees up at a high angle really gently. And the reason he's doing that, guys, okay, is because that steel that he's using has a high ability to bend to a certain number of degrees. And if he's got a little tiny bit of damaged metal left there, then when he lifts that up, it's got to bend a few more degrees to cling on, and he is exceeding the limit of that positive burr formation mechanics in order to shear off the damaged metal. So Cliff Stamp would, his edges would just be falling through phone book paper after like 5 minutes because he was so good at knowing how to sharpen his preferred steel. And he made it work for him and got phenomenal results. Another guy that comes to mind is Vadim Krychuk, who introduced me to a lot of this thought about positive and negative burrs. And Vadim would sharpen things all across the spectrum, but he dealt with a lot of positive burr steels. He liked them because he was good at getting performance out of them. And he had different methodologies, but the one that I remember the best is he would start out with the edge and he would sort of hone and get it dialed in to a certain extent on one piece of gear. And then he would actually change the angle and remove material with another hone all the way out to where you just have this little micro bevel left of the first sharpening. And so you've actually carved these reliefs out so that you can attack that. And then for his negative burr steels, he would strop them at the sharpening angle, and the honing, the stropping would be just enough to take off the rest of that little bit of steel to form a new apex. But he had a list of positive burr steels that he had tested and found out the exact angle they could take. And if he was working with a positive burr steel instead, rather than running his stropping or finishing wheel at this, because he did all mechanized sharpening. It largely was not hand sharpening, hence the name knife grinders. But if he had one that was largely positive burr steel, like he knew his Victorinox could take edge angle plus about 1.2 degrees, if I remember right. And so he'd bring in his buffing wheel, his rock hard felt or whatever he's using, and he would add 1.2 degrees to each side. And on each side, he would do a high angle strop to finish. And that would actually rip off all of the damaged metal, and he would come up with these sharper than a razor edges. Another guy that comes to mind that does wonderful work is Sean Houston, Big Brown Bear. And if you watch Sean's sharpening videos, okay, first of all, he's like selected mostly steels from this side, and then he's hardened them to be even further to this side. So as you'd expect, like Sean Houston gives this phenomenal input for getting really clean edges, especially on your negative burr steels. And Sean will have really high quality diamond gear, and he'll say things like, you need to go like edge trailing only on my knives, on my stones, like that's how it goes. And does he get great results? Yeah, he gets phenomenal results. And the thing is that he's done the work on the steel side so that an edge trailing stroke on a really technical stone is all you need to actually fully deburr, because you're working with steels that have been optimized for negative burr sharpening. Sean's not going to advise you to do high angle edge leading strokes. Sean's not going to advise you to use super compressive strops and really large particles. Why not? Well, because the steel that he uses, it deburrs on normal gear, flatter, harder, finer strops just as well. And in fact, you will begin to lose performance if your particles and your compression in your strop is too high, because that tip of that Rex 121, that 15V, that whatever he's working with, it doesn't like to be pressed hard by a big particle. It doesn't want that for deburring. That's only going to lead it to form microchips earlier than what you want. And so it's really similar, and it harkens back. I'm like making my way slowly back around to, this is how this relates to the conversation with Erica. She was going through these, like, if you have a steel like Rex 121, Maximet, 15V, and on down, then you don't want to attack them with these big particle sharpening stones. You're only going to be forming microchipping during sharpening. And yeah, one of the reasons for that is the flexibility that is within the steel. And one of the things that she's referencing is actually the way that burr formation works and why certain sharpening methods work really well for softer steels and certain sharpening methods work really well for harder steels. And the ones that work well for hard steels usually leave a burr on a positive burr steel. The ones that work really well for a positive burr steel, they often will lead to chipping or rounding in a really hard steel. Hopefully that made sense. It's a complicated-ish concept, but I hope I've distilled it down to where the layperson is like, oh, I get it enough for it to improve my sharpening. Let me know in the comments. Erica, thanks heaps for this conversation that you're starting among us, the knife sharpening community crew. And I hope all you guys have a good day. I'll say peace out from the Home Slice for now. Take care. Bye.